Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched the stars blur past the main window as they jumped through space faster than light could travel. The ship was not very big compared to the massive cargo vessels that traveled between Earth and Mars, but it was the fastest thing humans had ever built, and it could go farther from home than any human had gone before. Lisa Chang sat at her navigation station and checked the numbers on her screen for the 10th time in 5 minutes. She was the best pilot Earth had, and she knew exactly where they were going, but something felt wrong about this jump. The stars outside looked different, and the computer was making soft beeping sounds that it never made before. Pete Rodriguez was in the engine room 3 levels below the bridge, and he could hear the hyperspace drive making a grinding noise that hyperspace drives should never make. He had built this engine himself, and he knew every sound it should make and every sound it should not make. This was definitely a sound it should not make. Amy Watson pressed buttons on her communication panel and tried to contact Earth, but she was getting nothing but static on all frequencies. She had been talking to Mission Control just 5 minutes before they jumped, but now her radio was completely quiet. The silence made her nervous because space was never completely quiet. Danny Sullivan checked his security monitors and made sure all the doors were locked and all the weapons were ready. He did not expect to need weapons on a simple exploration mission, but his job was to be ready for anything, and he took his job very seriously. Jake looked at his crew and saw that they were all worried about something. The jump was supposed to take them to a star system about 50 light years from Earth, where they would take pictures and collect samples and then come home. Instead, the stars outside looked completely wrong, and none of their instruments were working properly. The grinding noise from the engine room got louder, and Pete's voice came over the ship radio sounding worried. The hyperspace drive was overheating and making sparks, and if they did not drop out of hyperspace soon, the whole ship might explode. Jake told Lisa to shut down the drive immediately and bring them back to normal space. The New Horizon dropped out of hyperspace with a violent shake that threw everyone against their chairs. The lights flickered and went out for a few seconds before the emergency power came on. When the main lights came back on, Jake looked out the window and saw something that made him forget about their broken engine. A space station the size of a small moon sat in front of them, covered with lights and weapons and docking bays big enough to hold 1,000 ships. The station was made of dark metal that reflected the light from a nearby star, and it had huge towers sticking out of it like the spikes on a sea urchin. Jake had never seen anything so big that was built by intelligent beings. Lisa checked her navigation computer and confirmed what Jake already knew. They were not anywhere near the star system they were supposed to visit. They were not anywhere near any star system that humans had ever seen before. The computer could not even figure out where they were because none of the stars matched any of the star maps from Earth. Amy tried her radio again, and this time she got an answer, but it was not from Earth. Strange voices speaking in languages she had never heard before filled the communication channels. The voices sounded excited, and some of them sounded angry, and all of them seemed to be talking about the New Horizon. Danny watched his security monitors and saw ships approaching them from the giant space station. The ships were bigger than anything humans had ever built, and they had weapons that looked like they could destroy planets. At least 20 of these ships surrounded the New Horizon, and more were coming. A voice spoke to them in perfect English and told them to prepare to be boarded. The voice belonged to someone who called himself Admiral Vextar, and he said he was speaking for the Zephyrian Empire. Jake had never heard of the Zephyrian Empire, but he figured it was probably important if they could build space stations the size of moons. Jake told his crew to stay calm and do exactly what the aliens told them to do. He did not want to start a war with beings who had weapons that could blow up their ship without even trying hard. Pete turned off all the weapons systems, and Amy sent a message saying they would cooperate with whatever the aliens wanted. Alien ships attached themselves to the New Horizon with metal tubes, and Jake could hear footsteps in the corridors as the boarding party came aboard. The footsteps sounded heavy, like the beings making them were much bigger than humans. Jake straightened his uniform and walked to the main airlock to meet their visitors. Admiral Vexitar was 7 feet tall and looked like a giant lizard walking on 2 legs. His skin was green and covered with scales, and his eyes were yellow with black slits like a snake. He wore a uniform covered with medals and insignia, and he carried weapons that hummed with energy. Behind him came 6 more beings that looked just like him but smaller. The Admiral looked around the bridge of the New Horizon, and Jake could see disappointment in his yellow eyes. The human ship was tiny compared to the alien vessels, and it did not have impressive weapons or advanced technology. Jake wondered if the aliens were expecting to find something more impressive. Jake stepped forward and extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. Admiral Vextar looked at the offered hand for a long moment, before reaching out with his own scaled hand and shaking it carefully. His grip was strong enough to crush human bones, but he was gentle. Jake offered the Admiral a cup of coffee from the small kitchen near the bridge. Admiral Vexitar had never seen coffee before, and he sniffed it suspiciously before taking a small sip. His eyes widened, and he took another sip and then another. Jake smiled because everyone liked coffee once they tried it. The Admiral began to speak about the power of the Zephyrian Empire and how they controlled hundreds of star systems and thousands of worlds. He showed Jake pictures on a small device of planets covered with cities and fleets of warships that stretched from one side of a solar system to the other. The images were meant to impress and intimidate. Jake looked at the pictures with interest and nodded politely. He mentioned that Earth had some big cities too, and that humans had built some impressive things in their time. When the Admiral showed him pictures of weapons that could destroy entire planets, Jake nodded again and said that humans had figured out how to do that decades ago, but decided it was not a very good idea. Admiral Vextar stared at Jake for a long moment. He was used to newly discovered species falling to their knees in terror when they saw the might of the Empire. Instead, this human was drinking coffee and making casual conversation as if seeing galaxy-spanning civilizations was something that happened every day. The Admiral tried a different approach and showed Jake footage of battles where the Empire had conquered other species. The videos showed cities burning and populations fleeing in terror as Imperial forces took control of their worlds. The Admiral expected Jake to beg for mercy and promised to surrender immediately. Jake watched the videos with the same expression he might have when watching a history documentary. He mentioned that Earth had gone through some pretty rough wars, too, and that it was always sad when people had to fight each other. He asked if the Empire had figured out better ways to solve disagreements because fighting was expensive and usually made more problems than it solved. Admiral Vextar was completely confused. Every other species he had ever encountered had either attacked his ships in desperate fury or cowered in helpless terror. These humans seemed to treat his demonstrations of Imperial power as mildly interesting historical information. He wondered if humans were too primitive to understand what they were seeing or if they were too advanced to be impressed by it. The Imperial transport ship that carried the humans to Zephyr Prime was bigger than most Earth cities, and it moved through space faster than anything humans had ever imagined possible. Jake and his crew sat in what the aliens called guest quarters, but which looked more like a luxury hotel suite, with windows that showed the stars rushing past at impossible speeds. Lisa spent most of the journey studying the star charts that Admiral Vextar had given them and asking questions about how the aliens navigated through space. She was fascinated by their hyperspace technology and wanted to know how they managed to jump such long distances without getting lost. The alien technicians were surprised that she understood their mathematics so well. Pete made friends with the Imperial engineers and spent hours looking at their engine designs and power systems. He showed them pictures of human technology, and they were amazed that humans had figured out how to split atoms and harness fusion power with such primitive tools. They traded technical knowledge like children trading baseball cards. Amy set up her communication equipment and started broadcasting Earth music on the frequencies the aliens used for entertainment. She did not expect anyone to listen, but within a few hours she was getting requests from young Zephyrians who wanted to hear more of the strange sounds from the human homeworld. Jazz music became especially popular. Danny practiced his martial arts in the exercise room and drew curious crowds of Imperial soldiers who wanted to see how humans fought. They were impressed by his speed and technique, but confused by his philosophy of using minimal force to achieve maximum results. Most alien combat styles involved overwhelming power and brutal efficiency. The transport ship arrived at Zephyr Prime after 3 days of travel, and Jake looked out the window at a planet that was completely covered with cities. There were no forests or oceans or natural landscapes anywhere on the surface. Every square inch of the planet had been turned into buildings and roads and industrial facilities. The imperial capital was a pyramid the size of a mountain that rose from the center of the largest city. The pyramid was made of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and it had thousands of windows that glowed with different colored lights. This was where Emperor Mordak ruled his vast empire. Jake and his crew were taken to the throne room, which was bigger than most sports stadiums and filled with alien beings from dozens of different species. Some looked like giant insects, and others looked like living crystals, and still others looked like things that had no name in any human language. All of them knelt when the Emperor appeared. Emperor Mordak was 12 feet tall and floated 3 feet above the ground without any visible means of support. His body was humanoid, but made of what looked like living shadow that shifted and moved constantly. His eyes were points of white light that seemed to see through anything they looked at, including the souls of the beings standing before him. The Emperor spoke without moving his mouth, and his voice filled the entire throne room and echoed inside the minds of everyone present. He told Jake that the Zephyrian Empire had ruled this galaxy for 10,000 years, and that countless species had knelt before his throne and begged for the privilege of serving his will. Jake listened politely, and when the Emperor finished speaking, he complimented the architecture of the throne room and mentioned that humans had built some impressive buildings too, although nothing quite as big as this. Amy took pictures with her camera like a tourist visiting a famous landmark. Emperor Mordak was not used to beings who treated his throne room like a tourist attraction. He decided to demonstrate his psychic powers by taking control of several alien courtiers and making them dance like puppets on strings. The controlled beings moved in perfect synchronization while their eyes showed the terror they felt at being helpless. Danny watched the demonstration with professional interest and mentioned that humans had dealt with similar problems during their advertising and propaganda phases of history. He explained that humans had developed pretty good mental resistance techniques after some bad experiences with mass manipulation and mind control experiments. The Emperor tried to read Jake's mind, but found it surprisingly difficult to penetrate human thoughts. Human minds seemed to be naturally chaotic and full of random information that made psychic control almost impossible. The Emperor wondered if this was a deliberate defense mechanism or just the way human brains worked. Lisa was still studying the star charts and asking technical questions about Imperial navigation systems. She mentioned that human space was much smaller, but that they had some interesting neighborhoods, including several black holes and a few neutron stars that made travel challenging. She seemed genuinely curious about how the Empire dealt with similar hazards. The Emperor's chief advisor was a being named Velkara, who looked like a cross between a spider and a computer terminal. Velkara specialized in psychological warfare and breaking the spirits of conquered species. She decided to show the humans footage of the Empire's most brutal conquests to demonstrate what happened to beings who refused to submit. The footage showed planets being destroyed and populations being enslaved and cities being burned to the ground. Velkara expected the humans to break down in terror or at least show some sign of fear or revulsion. Instead, they watched with the detached interest of people viewing a historical documentary. Pete occasionally commented on the tactical efficiency of certain weapon systems and suggested improvements that could make the Imperial military more effective. Amy took notes about the different alien species they saw in the footage and asked questions about their cultures and technologies. Jake mentioned that humans had gone through some pretty messy periods in their own history and that war was always terrible, but sometimes necessary. He said that Earth had learned some hard lessons about the costs of conflict and that most humans preferred to find peaceful solutions when possible. Emperor Mordak was becoming frustrated with these strange beings, who seemed immune to intimidation. He offered them the standard choice that he gave to all newly contacted species: submit to Imperial rule and become productive members of galactic civilization, or be destroyed as an example to others who might resist. Jake asked if there was a third option and suggested that maybe they could work out some kind of friendly neighbor arrangement. He mentioned that humans were not really looking to join any empires right now, having recently gotten out of some pretty complicated political situations back on Earth. The Emperor had never been asked for a third option before. In 10,000 years of galactic conquest, no species had ever suggested that they might prefer to remain independent while maintaining friendly relations with the Empire. The concept was so alien to Imperial thinking that the Emperor did not know how to respond. Velkara whispered suggestions to the Emperor about making an example of human defiance. But the Emperor was curious about these beings who treated galactic conquest like a neighborhood dispute. He decided to assign them a cultural liaison to study human behavior and find weaknesses that could be exploited. Later, Commander Zixara was chosen for this task because she was young and ambitious and had successfully analyzed dozens of species for the Imperial War Machine. She was confident that she could break down human psychology and find the fears and desires that would make them submit to Imperial authority. Zixara looked like a tall, thin human woman, except for her silver skin and completely black eyes. She spoke perfect English and had studied every piece of information the Empire had gathered about human culture. She expected to find a primitive species with simple motivations and obvious weaknesses. Instead, she found beings who had survived ice, ages and plagues and nuclear wars and climate disasters, and still managed to work together well enough to reach the stars. Humans had faced extinction dozens of times in their history and had always found ways to adapt and overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The humans were given quarters in what was essentially a luxury prison designed to make them comfortable, while keeping them under constant observation. Jake and his crew treated it like a hotel and settled in to wait and see what would happen next. They had been in worse situations before, and they were confident they could handle whatever the Empire threw at them. Commander Zixara began her psychological analysis by showing the humans recordings of Imperial slave worlds, where conquered populations worked in mines and factories under brutal conditions. She expected them to be horrified by the cruelty and begged the Empire not to inflict such a fate on humanity. Instead, the humans expressed genuine sympathy for the suffering populations and offered practical advice about transitioning away from slave-based economies. They mentioned that Earth had gone through similar phases and had learned that free workers were generally more productive and created fewer security problems than slave Zixara was completely unprepared for subjects who analyzed imperial brutality like economists studying inefficient business models. Commander Zixara spent her days watching the humans through hidden cameras and listening to their conversations through concealed microphones, but nothing they did made any sense according to Imperial psychology textbooks. The humans should have been terrified and desperate, and looking for ways to escape or surrender, but instead, they seemed to be treating their captivity like an extended vacation. Amy had set up her communication equipment in their quarters and was broadcasting Earth music on Imperial entertainment frequencies for several hours each day. The broadcasts had become so popular among young Zephyrians that Imperial censors were getting complaints from parents who said their children were listening to strange alien sounds instead of proper Imperial music. The music was having effects that no one had predicted. Young Zephyrians were learning English words from the songs and starting to ask questions about human culture and philosophy. Some of them were even beginning to question whether the Empire's methods of conquest were the only way to build a civilization. Pete had been given access to Imperial technical databases as part of Zixara's psychological analysis, and he was having the time of his life studying alien engineering principles. He spent most of his time trading ideas with Imperial scientists who were fascinated by humanity's approach to problem-solving with limited resources. The Imperial engineers were amazed that humans had figured out how to build space-worthy vessels, using such primitive materials and manufacturing techniques. Pete explained that when you did not have access to advanced alien technology, you had to get creative and find ways to make things work with whatever materials you could find. Lisa was working with Imperial navigation specialists to understand how their hyperspace technology functioned, and she was sharing human discoveries about space-time manipulation and quantum mechanics. The alien navigators were surprised to learn that humans had independently discovered many of the same mathematical principles they used. Danny was the source of the most confusion for Zixara because he did not fit any of the psychological profiles she had for warrior species. When she arranged for him to spar with Imperial soldiers, he defeated them easily, but without causing permanent injury, and he spent time afterward explaining human combat philosophy. The Imperial military was built on the principle that overwhelming force and brutal efficiency were the keys to victory. Danny showed them fighting techniques that used an opponent's strength against them and required minimal energy to achieve maximum results. The alien soldiers were intrigued by the concept of winning fights without destroying enemies. Jake spent his time reading Imperial history and asking questions about how the Empire had grown so large and managed to stay in power for so long. His questions were not the kind that conquered species usually asked, because he seemed genuinely interested in understanding Imperial methods rather than finding ways to resist them. Zixara decided to escalate her psychological pressure by taking the humans on tours of Imperial facilities that were designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance. She showed them weapons testing facilities where Imperial scientists developed new ways to destroy planets and subjugate populations. The weapons were impressive by any reasonable standard and could eliminate all life on a world in minutes or reduce entire star systems to radioactive debris. Zixara expected the humans to be overwhelmed by the scale of Imperial military power, but instead they discussed the weapons like engineers evaluating industrial equipment. Pete asked technical questions about power requirements and targeting systems, while Lisa wondered about the logistics of deploying such massive weapons across galactic distances. Amy took pictures and asked if the Empire had ever considered using their advanced technology for terraforming dead worlds instead of destroying living ones. Danny observed that the weapons seemed designed more for intimidation than practical military use because anything powerful enough to destroy planets would be too expensive to use regularly. He mentioned that humans had learned to prefer precision weapons that could achieve specific objectives without causing unnecessary collateral damage. Jake listened to explanations of Imperial military doctrine and mentioned that Earth had gone through a similar phase during its early nuclear age, when every major power thought that having the biggest weapons was the key to security. He noted that humans had eventually figured out that such weapons were more dangerous to their owners than to their enemies. Zixara took them to see Imperial slave colonies, where conquered populations worked under harsh conditions to provide raw materials for the Empire's industrial machine. These colonies were meant to show what happened to species that refused Imperial generosity and continued to resist after being offered the chance to join galactic civilization. The humans toured the facilities with the same calm attention they brought to everything else and asked practical questions about worker productivity and resource allocation. They mentioned that Earth had experimented with similar labor systems in its past, but had abandoned them when better alternatives became available. Jake pointed out that slave labor was inefficient because it required enormous amounts of security and produced workers who had no motivation to innovate or improve their performance. He suggested that the Empire might get better results by offering incentives for productivity and allowing workers to share in the profits of their labor. Pete noticed that many of the industrial processes used in the slave colonies were unnecessarily complicated and suggested simpler methods that would require fewer workers and produce better results. He seemed genuinely interested in helping the Empire improve its manufacturing efficiency. Lisa studied the logistics of managing slave populations across multiple star systems and calculated that the Empire was probably spending more resources on security and transportation than they were gaining from the slave labor. She suggested that free workers living on their homeworlds might be more cost-effective. Amy interviewed some of the slaves when the guards were not watching and learned about their cultures and histories. She was sad about their situation, but she treated it like a social problem that could be solved with better policies rather than an inevitable result of galactic conquest. Danny observed the security arrangements at the slave colonies and pointed out several weaknesses in the Imperial systems that could lead to uprisings or escapes. He did not seem to be planning anything himself, but he mentioned that humans had learned to spot potential trouble areas after dealing with similar situations in their own history. Zixara was running out of ways to intimidate or impress the humans, and she was beginning to suspect that they might be more dangerous than they appeared. Species that could not be intimidated were often the ones that caused the most problems for the Empire in the long run. She decided to try a more direct approach and arranged for the humans to meet with other conquered species to hear firsthand accounts of what Imperial rule was like. She hoped that testimony from beings who had actually experienced conquest would finally break through human indifference. The meeting was held in a conference room deep inside the Imperial Palace and included representatives from a dozen different species that had been incorporated into the Empire over the past 1,000 years. Some had submitted peacefully, while others had fought desperate wars before being defeated. Each representative told their story of first contact with the Empire and the choices they had faced between submission and destruction. Some spoke of the benefits of Imperial citizenship, while others could barely hide their resentment at being forced to abandon their independence. The humans listened to every story with respectful attention and asked thoughtful questions about how different species had adapted to Imperial rule. They seemed genuinely interested in learning from the experiences of others rather than looking for ways to avoid similar situations. One representative from a species called the Valdris spoke about the prosperity that Imperial membership had brought to his people, and how they had learned to appreciate the security and stability that came with being part of a galactic civilization. His world had become a center of trade and culture under Imperial guidance. Jake mentioned that humans had formed similar alliances in their own history, and that cooperation between different groups usually produced better results than isolation. He asked about the process of joining the Empire and whether there were different levels of membership available for different species. Another representative from a species called the Corax spoke bitterly about the wars that had devastated his home world before his people finally surrendered to Imperial forces. His species had lost billions of lives in a hopeless struggle against Imperial technology before accepting that resistance was futile. Danny expressed sympathy for the losses, but mentioned that humans had fought similar wars against overwhelming odds and had learned that sometimes survival required making difficult compromises. He asked whether the Corax had been able to maintain any of their cultural traditions under Imperial rule. The most surprising response came from a representative of the Thyler who had been conquered so long ago that they had forgotten what independence felt like. She spoke about Imperial rule as a natural state of affairs and could not imagine any other way for a galactic civilization to function. Amy asked whether the Thyler had ever considered. Emperor Mordak had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and in all that time no species had ever treated his demonstrations of power with such casual indifference. The humans were either too primitive to understand what they were seeing, or too advanced to be impressed by it, and neither possibility was acceptable to the Imperial ego. The Emperor summoned his war council and announced that he would make an example of humanity by destroying their entire solar system. The humans would watch as their homeworld burned and their species was reduced to a handful of survivors who would spend the rest of their lives as slaves, warning other species about the cost of defying Imperial will. Admiral Vextar suggested that such extreme measures might be unnecessary, since the humans had not actually threatened the Empire or committed any acts of aggression. They were simply too ignorant to understand the honor being offered to them and might respond better to patient education than immediate destruction. The Emperor rejected this advice because patience was not an Imperial virtue, and education took too long when there were examples to be made. The destruction of Earth would serve as a lesson to hundreds of other species who might be considering resistance, and the psychological impact would be worth more than any planets the Empire might conquer. Commander Zixara requested permission to continue her studies of human psychology because she believed that understanding their mental processes might reveal weaknesses that could be exploited without resorting to genocide. She argued that completely destroying a unique species was wasteful when they might be converted into useful Imperial citizens. The Emperor dismissed her concerns because the Empire had plenty of useful citizens and did not need to preserve every species they encountered. The humans had proven themselves immune to standard Imperial conditioning and were therefore more dangerous alive than dead. The Imperial war fleet began assembling in orbit around Zephyr Prime, and within days it included more than 1,000 ships capable of sterilizing entire worlds. The fleet was larger than anything the Empire had deployed in centuries and represented enough firepower to conquer a dozen star systems simultaneously. Jake and his crew were brought to the observation deck of the Imperial flagship, where they would have an excellent view of Earth's destruction when the fleet arrived in human space. The Emperor wanted them to watch their homeworld die and finally understand the consequences of refusing Imperial generosity. The flagship was a mobile fortress the size of a small moon with weapons that could crack planets in half and shields that could deflect the energy output of entire stars. It was the most powerful warship ever built, and it served as the Emperor's personal command vessel when he wanted to personally oversee important military operations. Jake looked out at the assembled fleet and whistled appreciatively at the impressive display of military engineering. He mentioned that humans had built some big ships too, but nothing quite on this scale, and asked about the logistics of coordinating such a large force across interstellar distances. The Emperor was expecting terror or desperate pleas for mercy, but instead, Jake seemed genuinely curious about Imperial military organization. When shown the fleet's capabilities, Jake nodded politely and mentioned that Earth had been monitoring Imperial activities since their arrival and had taken some precautions. Lisa activated a small device she had been carrying, and suddenly the observation deck filled with holographic displays showing detailed scans of every ship in the Imperial fleet. The scans included complete structural analyses and weapons specifications, and even the personal files of individual crew members. The data had been collected by human stealth probes that had been studying Imperial technology throughout their visit to Zephyr Prime. The probes were so small and advanced that Imperial sensors had never detected them, despite being deployed throughout the most secure facilities in the Empire. Pete explained that human engineers loved technical challenges and had been excited by the opportunity to study Imperial technology up close. They had reverse-engineered several key systems and developed hybrid human-alien technologies that combined the best features of both civilizations. Amy established a communication link with Earth, and the response from humanity was not panic or desperate surrender but calm professional interest in opening diplomatic relations. Earth's leaders wanted to discuss trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and seemed to view the Imperial fleet as a negotiating position rather than an extinction threat. The human response included detailed analyses of Imperial military doctrine and suggestions for improvements that could make their forces more effective. Earth's military strategists had studied the fleet's formation and identified several tactical weaknesses that could be exploited by smaller, more maneuverable forces. Danny mentioned that humans had learned to end conflicts quickly and efficiently, without unnecessary destruction, because prolonged wars usually created more problems than they solved. He suggested that negotiation might produce better results than demonstration of force. The Emperor ordered the fleet to jump immediately to Earth's solar system, where they would find a primitive species cowering behind their pathetic defenses and begging for mercy. The jump would take several hours, and when they arrived, the real demonstration of Imperial power would begin. The Imperial fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system and immediately deployed into battle formation with their most powerful ships in the center and screening vessels protecting the flanks. Imperial tactics had been refined over millennia of galactic conquest, and no species had ever withstood their coordinated assault. But Earth's defenses were unlike anything the Empire had encountered before. Instead of massive battle stations or fleets of dreadnoughts, the humans had deployed thousands of small craft that moved with impossible speed and agility through space around their homeworld. The human defenders did not try to destroy the Imperial fleet, but instead used precision strikes to disable key systems on individual ships. Weapons were neutralized without destroying the vessels that carried them, and communication arrays were jammed without killing the crews that operated them. Within hours, the mighty Imperial fleet found itself unable to fire its weapons or coordinate its movements while suffering almost no casualties. The human strategy seemed designed to end the conflict as quickly as possible while minimizing damage to both sides. Imperial commanders had trained for massive fleet engagements against enemies, who would fight to the death using conventional tactics. They had no experience dealing with opponents who could disable their ships without destroying them, and seemed more interested in avoiding casualties than achieving victory. The flagship's weapons were disabled by a series of precise strikes that left the crew unharmed but completely unable to return fire. The Emperor found himself in the unprecedented situation of being militarily defeated without losing a single ship or crew member to enemy action. Admiral Vex Tar reported that the human technology appeared to be a hybrid of Imperial systems and innovations that were completely unknown to galactic science. The humans had somehow combined their own engineering principles with stolen Imperial designs to create weapons that were more effective than anything the Empire had ever seen. The tactical situation was unprecedented in Imperial history. The fleet was intact but helpless, while the enemy remained hidden behind defensive screens that Imperial sensors could not penetrate. Any attempt to advance toward Earth would result in more ships being disabled without the possibility of retaliation. Jake opened a communication channel with the Imperial flagship and suggested that since both sides had demonstrated their capabilities, it might be time to discuss a peaceful resolution to their disagreement. He mentioned that humans preferred to solve problems through negotiation rather than continued escalation. The Emperor realized that he was facing something completely outside his experience. The humans had not surrendered in terror, but they had not launched a desperate suicidal attack either. Instead, they had neutralized his fleet with surgical precision and were now offering to negotiate as equals for the first time in 3,000 years of rule. Emperor Mordak found himself in a position where he could not simply impose his will through superior force. The humans had proven that they could defend themselves effectively while still leaving room for diplomatic solutions. Commander Zixara watched the tactical displays and realized that her analysis of human psychology had been completely wrong. The humans were not primitive or advanced beyond Imperial understanding. They were simply experienced in ways that galactic civilization had never been tested. The standoff continued for several days, with both fleets maintaining their positions. While diplomatic messages traveled between Earth and the Imperial flagship, neither side wanted to escalate the conflict, but neither was willing to surrender their position without achieving some of their objectives. Jake suggested that representatives from both governments meet on neutral ground to discuss terms for a peaceful coexistence. He mentioned that humans had extensive experience with international relations and might be able to suggest frameworks that would satisfy both sides' requirements for security and independence. The neutral meeting ground was a space station halfway between Earth and Zephyr Prime that had been constructed in just 2 weeks using combined human and Imperial technology. The station was a remarkable achievement of cooperative engineering that impressed observers from both civilizations with what could be accomplished when different species worked together. Emperor Mordak arrived at the station aboard his flagship, but without the massive fleet that usually accompanied him on diplomatic missions. The humans had suggested that smaller delegations would create a more comfortable atmosphere for negotiations, and the Emperor had reluctantly agreed to try their approach. Jake and his crew served as the primary human negotiators, along with diplomatic experts who had been sent from Earth specifically for these talks. The human delegation was much smaller than typical Imperial negotiating teams, but they seemed confident in their ability to represent their species' interests. The first formal meeting took place in a conference room that had been designed to accommodate beings of different sizes and environmental needs. The room had adjustable gravity and atmosphere controls and furniture that could be reconfigured for various alien physiologies. Emperor Mordak began the negotiations by explaining that the Imperial offer of membership was still available, and that humanity could join the galactic community as productive citizens if they were willing to accept Imperial authority. The offer was generous by Imperial standards and included significant autonomy for human colonies. Jake thanked the Emperor for the generous offer but explained that humanity was not currently interested in joining any galactic empires. Humans had recently emerged from some complicated political situations in their own history and preferred to maintain their independence while establishing friendly relations with their neighbors. The Emperor was confused by this response because in his experienced species either submitted to Imperial rule or were destroyed as examples to others. The concept of maintaining independence while establishing diplomatic relations was completely foreign to Imperial thinking. Lisa presented star charts showing human space and explained that while their territory was much smaller than the Empire, it included some unique astronomical phenomena that might be of scientific interest to Imperial researchers. She suggested that cooperative scientific expeditions could benefit both civilizations. Pete described human manufacturing techniques that had been developed to work with limited resources and suggested that Imperial industries might find some of these methods useful for improving efficiency. He offered to share human engineering principles in exchange for access to Imperial materials, science research. Amy proposed cultural exchange programs that would allow young beings from both civilizations to learn about each other's histories and traditions. She mentioned that her music broadcasts had been popular with young Zephyrians and suggested that broader cultural contact might help prevent future misunderstandings. Danny discussed security arrangements that could protect both civilizations from external threats while respecting each other's territorial boundaries. He explained that humans had extensive experience with alliance systems and could suggest frameworks that had proven effective in similar situations. The Emperor listened to these proposals with growing amazement because they assumed that the Empire would treat humanity as an equal partner rather than as subjects to be incorporated into the Imperial system. No,